what you'd like to know from this model is you'd like to know something about when I change P, do people actually respond, right? And whether they respond might depend on their beliefs about whether or not, if I increase P, the probability of detection, whether they can actually bribe the person who's coming to inspect them, or whether they can, or they won't be able to, right? So it depends a bit on their beliefs about kind of what's going to happen in that inspection. Is it going to be, they're going to be able to bribe their way out of it or not? We also might like to know something about, in this simple model, there's only one kind of corruption. But you can imagine there's lots of kinds of corruption in the world. And if I crack down on one, it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. I crack down on one, and it sort of pops up somewhere else. And then we need to think about, from an efficiency perspective, we need to think about which kind of corruption is worse, in some sense. And then the final thing we might want to think about is this about efficiency or is this just transfer? So this goes back to the point I was making before. Do we think there are real kind of social losses from this corruption that we're getting rid of, or do we think it's just sort of about moving the rents across and not kind of changing social welfare? So what I want to talk about now is a paper of mine on monitoring corruption. So this is an experiment that I did in Indonesia where we were looking at village-level road projects. Okay, so the way you should think about these, let me pass out the handout. You can pass that around. There you go. So these are village-level road projects. So the way you should think about these are like small roads, kind of 1 to 3 kilometers, going from like the center of the village out to the field or something like that, right? So if you've, if you've had, like if this was in Sumatra, if you've had Sumatran coffee, these are the roads that sort of go from the village out to the coffee fields or whatever. And these roads are not super, super sophisticated. They're not like, 4-lane highways. Most of them don't even have asphalt, but they do have sort of a bunch of layers of like sand and rock and gravel and things like that. And the key thing that they do, and the key reason they're important, is that when dirt roads get wet, they turn into mud, and you can't use them in the wet season, right? Because the trucks get stuck. Whereas these gravel rock roads, you can use them year-round. Okay, and so you can imagine it's a huge difference to a villager's social welfare if they can get the truck to the fields in the wet season versus if they can't. So the experiment I'm going to focus on is one where we told them in advance, before they built these road projects, that we randomly selected some of them and said, look, you're going to have a really high probability of a central government audit of your project. So in particular, in general, they had the probability of the central government coming to audit your project is about 0.04. And we said it's going to be 1. Like they're going to audit you for sure. And we did some other stuff too about invitations and grassroots participation, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about the audits. Okay? So that's the experiment. So basically said, look, we're going to change P. Yeah?
Was it true that you're going to come out of that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, it was totally true. And in fact, not only was it true, but they might have had the same question that you had, which is I got this letter from the central government, but like, letter schmetter, I've gotten tons of letters, they don't really materialize. So to make sure they believed it, the letter said, we are going to visit some, either during construction or after construction, sent out the letter. Then kind of construction started, and we picked one village in every sub-district that actually got audited pretty early on. Where the auditors came and they did their whole thing and they saw, and then they left. And then all the villages got another letter, which basically said, by the way, you saw that audit that happened in village so-and-so. That was part of these audit programs. We're going to come again at the end and audit all of you again. So it was really quite credible, I think. OK, so there's a question, though, of how do we measure corruption in this context. So we're going to do this idea of measuring 2 measures of the same thing. So what did we do? We measured the difference between, so our measure of corruption is the difference between what the village claimed it spent and what the village actually spent, or at least our best estimate of it. Okay? So to figure out what the village claimed it spent, that's pretty easy. It turns out the village gets the money from the government. It has to have a set of record books that sort of add up to the total amount of money it got. Right? So they got 100 million rupiah, which is like $10,000. Right? They have to have a set of prices and quantities. We bought so and so much gravel at this much per ton, and whatever, that adds up to the total amount of money they got from the government. Okay, and they have to keep the records of that, so we just got the record books. Now, figuring out what they actually spent is harder. And what we did is we basically worked with a bunch of civil engineers, actually, and went to the village and took core samples of the road and sort of measured, well, how much like, quantity of materials there are, and how much sand, and how much rock, and how much gravel. We did from sort of 10 different random samples of the roads. We could measure the length and width in the roads. We could multiply, that measures the kind of the depth, and we could multiply by the length and the width to get the total quantity, total volume of materials. We surveyed suppliers in nearby villages to sort of get what's the market price for these materials in this area. And then we interviewed villagers to figure out what the wage that this project paid and which of the tasks were done with paid labor versus voluntary labor. And this measurement we conducted everywhere, treatment in the controlled villages. So this is what this looks like, right? We basically, these are our little core samples. We sort of excavate, this is like, 20 by 20 little box, and sort of put all the rocks in here and all the sand in here and sort of measure the height to sort of estimate the volume. We do this at 10 different sites across the road. And you can see what the roads kind of look like. They're pretty basic. So the key measure we're going to look at is the difference in logs between what they claim they spent and our estimate for what they actually spent. Okay, and it's a difference in logs, I'll tell you for the following reason. And you can compute this item by item, prices, quantities, et cetera. So there's a key problem with this, which is if I think about doing this, right, they may have missed some. This is not exactly rocket science here, right? They may have missed some sand, or maybe some blew away. Or for those of you who've thought about like optimal packing problems, if I get a bunch of big rocks and I chop them up into rocks of heterogeneous size, they're going to be more compact than they were initially. And in fact, they actually do. They get these rocks, they chop them by hand, and break them up into smaller pieces and sort of put them in the road. So, what I order from a supplier is I order, 800 cubic meters of the big rocks. I measure in the road the sort of heterogeneous sized rocks. Maybe the volume is shrunk or whatever. And that's not corruption. We don't want to call that corruption. That's kind of just like life. So also, like for the labor, we don't know how many days it takes to do a task, right? So I sort of like, how many days of labor does it take to install 800 cubic meters of rock? Or how many days of labor does it take to split 800 cubic meters of rock by hand? I don't know. Like, that's the question. So what we did is we built these calibration roads. So we built 4 little roads ourselves. They were 60 meters long, and we measured all the inputs. Since we were paying for them ourselves, we measured all the inputs when they came. So we knew how much we had ordered. We didn't steal anything. And then we applied our own survey techniques to the roads that we built. And so you can think of this as like tearing a scale, right? So we sort of used these measures where we knew there was no corruption to sort of figure out what do we have to multiply this actual number by so that this ratio reads 0 on average in roads where we know there's no corruption.